At 1855 on May 3, 1945, the forward 40mm mount on USS Aaron Ward was already running red hot. Commander William Sanders could see the quad Bofors out his bridge wing as the ship heeled 15 degrees to starboard, her decks shrouded in smoke and spray. The destroyer mine layer was bleeding from 2 kamikaze hits. Men lay where they'd fallen. Fires licked at torn plating. And that damn gun was still firing. 4 barrels, slaved together on a power-driven mount, hammered into the evening sky at 320 rounds per minute. Each 40mm shell traced a bright arc out from the ship, a line of hate reaching for the specks diving out of the west. The gun captain, Seaman First Class Lavaris, stood hunched behind the shield, head set askew, face streaked with soot and blood. His loaders shoved 4 round clips down into the hot feed chutes as fast as their numbed hands could move. Spent brass rained at their feet, clanging against empty ammo tins and piling knee-deep around their boots. Aaron Ward was listing, settling by the stern as flooding crept through her guts. Water poured in through ragged holes at the waterline. Damage control teams were up to their ankles in it, fighting fires and patching ruptured mains. But the forward 40 didn't care. When the first wave had come in, Lavaris had kicked the firing pedal and kept his boot there. Someone had jammed a length of pipe into the linkage to keep it depressed, even when he stepped back to clear a jam. As long as the mount had power and ammunition, it would roar. That had been the stupid idea. Don't let this gun stop ever until the last Japanese plane is in the water or the ship goes under. Now, as a 4th suicide plane knifed down through the clouds, its wings already ablaze from hits, that idea was all that stood between Aaron Ward and oblivion. "Plane port bow! Low!" the director screamed over the TBS. The Bofors mount slew. Head slower now. Hydraulic pressure was dropping as the forward pump room flooded, but it moved. Tracers reached up again, a continuous stream walking steadily toward the oncoming speck. Behind that gun, hidden below decks amid the choking smoke, Steward First Class Carl Clark and his 7-man damage control team wrestled with shattered valves and fire hoses, buying the gun crew a few more minutes of life by keeping the ship afloat. Above them, on the bridge, Sanders gripped the rail with white knuckles as he watched another flash blossom around USS Little, just 2 miles off their starboard beam. The other destroyer mine layer was coming apart under 3 direct hits, her bow lifting, then snapping. In less than 6 minutes, 3 American ships on radar Picket Station Number 10 had been destroyed or crippled. Now 20-plus kamikazes were turning for their final runs. Aaron Ward was alone, and 1 quad 40mm mount, lashed into a kind of mechanical fury, was still spitting fire even as its own deck dipped closer to the sea. "How long can they keep that up?" the officer of the deck muttered. "Until the ammo's gone," Sanders said, "or we are." He watched the next kamikaze grow in his binoculars, a dark cross against the sunset. The tracers from Lavaris's mount began to intersect its path. Bits flew off the wings, smoke belched from the cowling, but still it held its line. "Come on," Sanders whispered. "Come on, Lavaris. Don't you dare let that gun stop." The Japanese plane swelled, filling his view. For a heartbeat, he couldn't tell whether it would clear them or carve straight through the bridge. Then the world vanished in light and flame again. To understand why 1 quad Bofors on Aaron Ward mattered, you have to understand where she was and what she'd been asked to do. By May 1945, the U.S. fleet off Okinawa was one of the most powerful assemblies of naval force in history. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, hundreds of escorts. Behind them, on the beaches and ridges of Okinawa itself, Marines and soldiers fought through villages and sugarcane fields against dug-in Japanese defenders. But all that strength had a vulnerable ring: radar picket stations. The Japanese had learned the hard way that going straight at the fleet meant running a gauntlet of fighters and massed flak. So they adapted. They sent their kamikazes low and wide, skimming in from different bearings, hunting the lonely destroyers and support ships strung out like beads on a wire, 50 to 70 miles from the main body. Those ships were the eyes of the fleet, early warning posts tied into the fighter direction network. On a plotting board in the Combat Information Center, CIC, aboard each picket, little grease pencil arrows showed squadrons of cap fighters intercepting raids at range. That was the theory. The reality was that the radar picket line drew more suicide attacks than any other assignment in the Pacific. Between April 1st and June 1st, 1945, destroyers on picket duty were sunk or battered with horrifying regularity. 16 went down or were so badly burned and broken that they were never repaired. Casualty rates ran above 30%. Most crews never survived more than 3 rotations on the line. USS Aaron Ward, DM-34, was on her 4th. She was a Robert H. Smith-class destroyer minelayer, built on destroyer lines but stripped of some torpedo and gun armament to make room for mine-laying gear. Commissioned in October 1944, she'd barely had time to shake down before joining the meat grinder around Okinawa. Her main battery, 3. The twin 5-inch 38 turrets, 6 barrels of dual-purpose fire. Around them, a bristle of anti-aircraft weapons, 6 Bofors, 40mm mounts, and a dozen 20mm Oerlikons scattered across the decks. It was good firepower for a 2,200-ton hull. It was nowhere near enough for what she was about to face. Commander William Sanders had 15 years in the Navy. He was not a man given to drama. His record was solid, his bridge manner calm. In 4 months in command of Aaron Ward, he had brought every man through alive, 0 ships lost on his watch. He was realistic enough to know that streak couldn't last forever on radar Picket Station number 10. 2 miles off his starboard, USS Little, another destroyer minelayer, shared the station. With them, LSM 195, a small landing ship, and LCS 25, a gunboat, added their own light AA fire and radar. On paper, the defense was layered. Aaron Ward's SK and SG radar sets watched the sky. Fighters from carriers and land bases orbited overhead on cap. CIC aboard the pickets would see incoming raids, vector CAP-E, and only as a last resort would the ships themselves have to stand alone. But Kikusui Number 5 was not a raid. It was a storm. The Japanese launched approximately 25 aircraft in a coordinated suicide attack that late afternoon. Fighters, dive bombers, single-engine trainers loaded with explosives, anything that could carry a pilot and a bomb. They came in low, under 2,000 feet, hugging the clutter where radar was least effective, seeking blind spots between cap, or simply betting on numbers. Send 30 planes and maybe 5 will get through. 5 hits was enough to break a picket station. On Aaron Ward, the men who would meet them were an odd, improvised family. Seaman First Class Lavaris, the forward 40mm gun captain, was a wiry Gulf Coast kid whose hands had been on some kind of gun, shotgun, 22, something, since he was old enough to walk. The Bofors quad mount was his kingdom. He knew the feel of its traverse motors, the rhythm of its recoil. He called it the sewing machine, a joke about its staccato chatter that masked how much he feared it might one day jam when he needed it most. Below decks, Steward First Class Carl Clark wore a very different set of stripes. At 29, he was older than many of the white seamen above him. One of 6 black sailors in a crew of over 300, he lived with the quiet, grinding reality of a segregated Navy. Mess duties, cleaning, the jobs that didn't make headlines. But Clark had also found his way into damage control drills. He had a knack for knowing where the water would go when something broke and how to stop it. On a ship where one bad hit could open a dozen compartments to the sea, that skill mattered more than what color the man's skin was, at least to the steel in the ocean. He led an 8-man DC team stationed near the ammunition lockers and pump controls. If the gunners kept the planes away, he'd barely be noticed. If they failed, he and his men would be the ones in the dark, with the fire hoses and shoring timbers, trying to keep Aaron Ward afloat long enough for someone to help her. For 3 days, they had watched the same pattern repeat. Kamikazes probing, fighters intercepting some, missing others. Here and there, a single-engine plane slipping through to dive straight at a picket. 17 attackers had come at Station 10 in 72 hours. Aaron Ward's gunners had shot down 11. A good score, not good enough to make anyone feel safe. On the afternoon of May 3rd, as the sun sagged toward the horizon and the sea took on that metallic evening sheen, Sanders stood in CIC watching little blips proliferate on the radar repeaters. Contacts, 25 of them, converging. Range 27 miles, the radar operator said. Speed about 280, multiple bearings. The cap controller's voice came jagged over the TBS. Fighters vectoring, squadrons committing. But there were too many arrows on the plot, and not enough caps to swat them all. The arithmetic was as cold as the steel under their boots. Most bomber crews in Europe could at least pretend to be part of a system that balanced risk. Fighter escorts, diversionary raids, jamming. On a radar picket off Okinawa, the men of Aaron Ward and Little had no such illusions. They knew the statistics. They'd seen what happened to ships that got caught out here alone. When Sanders stepped out onto the bridge wing and raised his binoculars toward the north, he could already see faint specks against the sky. The Kikusui wave had found them. The first explosions bloomed over someone else's deck. At 1842, Sanders watched through his binoculars as a kamikaze slammed into USS Little's superstructure. Little had been fighting off attackers for minutes already, her own 5-inch and 40mm guns chattering. Now a low-flying aircraft, maybe a Zero, maybe an aging trainer from some inland strip, darted under her fire and plowed into the area aft of her bridge. Flame shot up along her mast. For a heartbeat she seemed to shrug it off. Then a second kamikaze hit 40 seconds later, then a third in rapid succession. Jesus, someone on Aaron Ward's bridge breathed. At 1844, Little's forward magazine went up. A white-hot flash tore her in two. Bow and stern reared, then began to slide under separately. 30 sailors went with her. Many more were blown or burned into the sea. 2 miles wasn't far enough to be safe. Aaron Ward felt the concussion roll across the water. A low physical thump you could feel in your boots. Little's gone, the plotting officer said quietly in CIC, looking at the empty spot where her IFF return had been. By 1846, LSM 195 took its own hit. The small landing ship vanished in a roiling ball of fire, fuel and ammunition cooking off in a single colossal detonation. When the smoke cleared, there was no recognizable ship left, just burning wreckage and an expanding slick. There were no survivors. LCS-25, the little landing craft support gunboat, lost her mainmast and radar to a near miss. A kamikaze clipped her array and cartwheeled into the sea, taking her main eyes with it. 3 ships destroyed or crippled in 6 minutes. That was radar picket duty in late 1945. A bad neighborhood where bad things happened fast. By the book, the cap should have intercepted most of the attackers dozens of miles out. That book didn't account for weather, sun angles, skillful Japanese route planning, or simple sature. Gentile. The Kikusui planners knew that pinpoint accuracy wasn't necessary. If 10 planes attacked a picket station and 3 got through, that was enough. Every ship was vulnerable to even a single determined suicide pilot. In Aaron Ward's Combat Information Center, the air plot looked like a spider's web gone mad. Friendly fighters, known bogies, unknowns. The radarmen tried to keep bearings and ranges updated, but low-flying targets blinked in and out of the sod clutter. At 1840, they called up to the bridge. Multiple bandits now within 15 miles, altitude very low, bearing sectors 320 through 040. In other words, they were coming in from everywhere. On the open decks, the gun crews could see them now. Dark specks, some weaving, some steady, riding ground haze toward the ships. Training and doctrine had their say. Sanders ordered general quarters at 1848. The alarm bells clanged. "All hands, man your battle stations!" Within minutes, 36 men were at their posts. In the 5-inch mounts, gun captains checked fuse settings. The directors would call for time-fused airbursts, VT fuses if available, to put shells where fast-moving planes would be. Shellmen heaved 55-pound projectiles into hoists. Around the superstructure, Bofors crews loaded 4-round clips into feed chutes, action springs wound and ready. 20mm gunners slapped drum magazines into place, charged bolts. In that moment before first contact, every man knew the statistics, knew what had just happened to Little and LSM 195, knew that between April and June, more American sailors had died on these forward radar screens than almost anywhere else at sea. They also knew that someone had to stand here if the big carriers and transports were to survive. God help us, one loader muttered as he shoved another clip into the waiting jaws of the quad. In the forward 40mm mount, Lavares ran his hands over the Bofors curved shields and sighting gear. He felt the vibration of the ship under his boots, the hum of the electric motors running through the mount. He glanced back at the ready-service ammo racks, full, thanks to the scut work his team had done between attacks. "Keep those clips coming," he told his crew. "We're not stopping until we're dry." Below decks, Carl Clark led his damage control team to their station by the magazines and pump controls. They donned helmets, life jackets, gloves, checked toolkits, shoring timber wedges, portable pumps, patches, and plugs. The plan was simple and grim. The gunners would try to keep the fire in the sky. When that failed, Clark and his men would deal with what fell out of it. The Japanese were 25 strong. Aaron Ward could put maybe 30 barrels into the air at once when everything was manned and running. It was, as always on the radar picket line, a terrible way to balance an equation. Lavares and his Bofors crew had already learned a hard lesson over the previous 3 days. The textbook rate of fire on paper meant nothing if you ran out of time between targets. On April 30th, a lone kamikaze had come in low and fast from aft starboard, masked by sun glare. The aft quad mount had been just a hair too slow to slew. A 5-inch mount took it instead, and the resulting near miss had peppered Aaron Ward with fragments, killing 2 and wounding more. In the smoking break that followed, Lavares sat with his back against his forward shield and thought about how little margin they really had. A kamikaze diving at 400 miles per hour from 4,000 yards gave you maybe 30 to 45 seconds of effective engagement time at 40mm range. In that window, any pause, clearing a misfeed, waiting for a gun captain's order, even the fraction of a second lost when you eased off the firing pedal, was a slice taken off your chances. The quad Bofors mount was designed around controlled bursts, on the pedal, off, adjust, back on. Good for ammunition economy, barrel life, and fine control. Not so great when 16 or 20 suicide planes were queuing up to kill you. The first stupid field modification was purely mechanical. On May 2nd, after yet another scramble to bring the forward 40 to bear on a sudden low-altitude threat, Lavares and his gunner's mate, Swede Johansson, spent an hour with a wrench, a length of pipe, and the firing pedal linkage. They rigged a removable bar, a simple, curved bit of scavenged pipe that could be jammed into the pedal mechanism to hold it down. Normally, the foot pedal closed the firing circuit. Depress it, current flows, the mount's firing solenoid trips, and the guns hammer. Release it, the circuit opens, the guns stop. With the pipe wedged in, the circuit stayed closed continuously. As long as the crew kept feeding clips and the barrels didn't melt, the quad would run. "Captain's gonna fry us if this cooks the barrels," Johansson had muttered. "If the barrels melt," Lavares shot back, "it'll be because we were still alive to hold the mounts this long. I'll take that trade." They showed the rig to the gunnery officer. He frowned, thought about barrel wear and overheating, thought about safety interlocks, and then he thought about the line of white wakes he'd watched diving toward other ships. "On my word only," he said. "You wedge that thing in when I tell you to. Once it's in, you keep that gun under control. No spraying trees and sky. Every tracer goes where it counts. Understood?" It wasn't the only modification. They worked out a human feed chain. Men stationed between the ready service lockers and the mount would pass 4-round clips hand to hand, bucket brigade style, so the loaders on the mount never had to reach far. A second loader team stood by with asbestos mitts to swap barrels if one started to glow cherry red. Automation, 1945 style. More hands, shorter motions, less wasted reaction time. Below, Carl Clark's DC team made their own quiet changes. On their own initiative, they had pre-rigged certain valves and pump lines so they could be switched faster if a hit came in a predictable place. Chalk marks on bulkheads indicated where to shore quickly to reinforce magazine bulkheads. They'd rehearsed how to keep power to the forward AA mounts, even if compartments below flooded, running alternate feeder cables, checking emergency circuits. Sanders knew some of this. Some he didn't. He wasn't sure he wanted to. Naval regulations existed for a reason, but he was also a realist. On the afternoon of May 3rd, as radar showed the storm coming, he walked past that forward Bofors mount and glanced at the wedge of pipe lying on the deck grating. "You really think you'll need that tonight, Lavaris?" he asked. The gun captain met his eyes, jaw tight. "Sir, when they come, I don't want this mount quiet for 1 second longer than it has to be." Sanders nodded once. "Then you do what you have to do. Just remember there's a ship under that gun." He didn't know it yet, but by sunset that stupid pipe would be part of the only thing keeping more kamikazes from plowing into his bridge. And that forward 40 would write itself into the memory of every man who survived as the gun that never stopped, even as Aaron Ward herself began to die under their feet. 30 miles away, on a Japanese airfield choked with dust and desperation, Petty Officer Second Class Sato Hiroshi climbed into a plane he knew he wouldn't be climbing out of. His mount was no sleek Zero. It was an old Nakajima Ki 43 Hayabusa, Oscar in Allied code, patched and repatched, with a simple wooden block bolted where guns once sat, now holding a crude sight. Beneath its belly, armorers had fixed a single 250 kilos bomb. Kikusui, floating chrysanthemum, attacks were supposed to be the Emperor's last thunder. Waves of suicide planes flung at the invaders off Okinawa, aiming to smash ships, slow the land battle, and bleed the Americans into negotiations. Sato had fought since '42. He'd flown escort over Rabaul, watched comrades die in burning cockpits, landed on fewer and fewer serviceable strips. Gasoline was thin, pilots thinner. Kikusui was the final terrible logic of a war gone bad. If you couldn't win the air war, you weaponized your pilots' deaths instead. In the ready hut, a young officer had laid it out in clipped, formal phrases. "Radar picket destroyers are the key," he'd said, pointer tapping a crude map. "They detect our attacks, direct the enemy fighters, strike them, and you blind the fleet." Photos, taken from high altitude, showed tiny specks on a gray sea, ships at numbered stations, colored grease pencil circles around them. "The Americans have many guns," the officer acknowledged, "but they are few ships, alone. In earlier attacks, pilots have reported their ammunition eventually runs low. They cannot shoot forever." Sato had listened, quiet. He had seen flak blankets before. He'd watched 40mm fire reach out, sawed off wings from friends' aircraft. He knew that American ships carried more guns now than ever. But he also knew that 25 planes arriving in a short window could overwhelm any point defense. Some would get through his aim pole. And today, anything on radar Picket Station number 10 still afloat when he arrived. He launched in fading light, part of a loose gaggle of fighters and lightly loaded bombers. No tidy formation, just a shared direction and a grim, shared purpose. They flew low, hugging the wave tops, slipping under American radar lobes when they could. The coastline fell behind. The sea ahead was dotted with whitecaps, and eventually, flak bursts. From a distance, American destroyers and mine layers looked small, insignificant. Up close, with their barrels vomiting tracer and shells, they were floating porcupines of steel. Sato watched lines of red and white tracers weave up toward distant specks. Other pilots in his wave. Some planes vanished in fire. Others staggered but held course. He could see one large ship exploding, split in two, another engulfed in a single enormous fireball. And there, between drifting clouds of smoke, a smaller destroyer-like silhouette still moving, spitting what looked like a solid stream of fire from one forward gun mount. He tightened his grip on the stick. Enough guns, he thought. We'll run out. Enough men will tire. He pushed his throttle forward and turned toward the island of tracer that was USS Aaron Ward. The first planes came in out of the northeast, low over the waves. Aaron Ward's 5-inch mounts opened at maximum range, throwing out VT-fused shells that burst into expanding balls of shrapnel ahead of the targets. 1-0 disintegrated, ripped apart by an invisible wall. Another caught a fragment through its engine and cartwheeled into the sea. Then the range closed to 5,000 yards, and it was Lavaris's turn. "Commence firing!" The gunnery officer barked over the internal circuits. The forward Quad 40 spat its first burst, tracers arcing out in 4 converging lines. Lavaris stamped his heel down and, with a quick glance at Sanders on the bridge, jammed the curved pipe into place under the pedal. The mount shook as all 4 barrels went into continuous fire. Clips slapped down the feed chutes as fast as the loaders could move, hands numbed by recoil and heat. The director above them, gyros humming, tracked the incoming planes and sent orders, lead, elevation, down through the power control system. The Bofors followed smoothly, barrels weaving slightly as they chased targets. A Zeke tried a beam approach, sliding in from port. The 40s adjusted, their tracers forming a sideways rake that intercepted the fighter at 2,000 yards. Hits walked from wingtip to cockpit. The Zero blossomed flame, rolled, and went in. Another plane came straight down the throat, using a low sun angle. The 5-inch mounts got 1 or 2 salvos away, then had to cease to avoid overshooting into their own destroyer. The 40s took over. The constant roar of the quad Bofors turned into background noise, like a gigantic sewing machine hammering away. The only time the barrels fell silent was when a clip misfed for a fraction of a second. The loaders were on those, clearing and slamming in fresh ammo before the aim wobbled. On the bridge, Sanders watched the air around his ship become a lethal geometry of intersecting trajectories. Then the first kamikaze got through. At 1858, a plane hammered in from starboard, low and fast, shadowed by the chaos of Little's dying fires. It took hits, wings peppered, smoke trailing, but held course. In seconds, it crossed the last 1,000 yards. "Brace for impact!" someone yelled. The aircraft slammed into Aaron Ward's superstructure aft, just above the waterline, bomb and fuel detonating together. Steel buckled inward, compartments flooded, fire burst out across the main deck. Clark felt the shock through the deck plates. In an instant, gauges in his DC station spun, some to 0, some off-scale high. A main feed pipe ruptured, water surged into a compartment. Somewhere, a generator went offline. "Get that pump started. You with me. Forward repair party now." He moved into smoke and screaming, his team at his heels. They found shattered bulkheads, oil on fire, a man pinned under fallen plating. Clark diverted hoses, organized a bucket brigade for foam, sent 2 men to pull the wounded sailor free while he slapped a plug into a jetted pipe. Above, the forward 40 hiccuped as its power feed fluttered. One of the cables to the mount's motors had taken a splinter. "Power's dropping," Johansen yelled. The slewing rate dropped, the mount sluggish. "Hang on," Lavaris snarled. "Hand-wheel it if you have to. Just keep those barrels on them." He signaled for local control. Even as the main director struggled to command through intermittent signals, the local pointer and trainer grabbed their wheels, muscles straining, and manually dragged the gun across the sky. The firing circuit stayed closed. The quad barked on. A second kamikaze tried a diving attack from Port Bow. The forward 5-inch mount and Lavaris's Bofors stitched its path with flak and tracer. Its left wing tore off. The plane corkscrewed, missing the ship by yards, and crashing into the sea so close the spray drummed the hull. Shrapnel from its detonation ripped across the forecastle. A loader on the 40mm mount screamed as a fragment gouged his leg. He fell. Another man stepped into his place without a word, shoving clips down past the wounded sailor's outstretched hand. Clark's world became a mosaic of local disasters. He moved from break to break, stuffing oak wedges into hull breaches, directing hoses onto flames, ordering flooded compartments sealed before they capsized the ship. "Keep power to Mount 41 and 43 if you have to shut everything else," he shouted at an electrician's mate. "They die. We all die." The Japanese kept coming. A third, then a 4th aircraft dove at Aaron Ward. Some were knocked down by 5-inch fire, bursting just short in mid-air. Others staggered on, their pilots literally dying in their cockpits as shrapnel tore into them, holding course with their last strength. One exploded in mid-plunge under the hammering Bofors fire, showering the bow with wreckage and fuel. Flaming debris rained down around Lavaris's mount. Men batted it away with gloved hands, never leaving their stations. Then a hit, too close for comfort. A fifth attacker clipped a mast, spun, and slammed into the water just off Aaron Ward's port quarter. The blast bent plating inward, tore holes at the waterline, and sent a jet of high-pressure seawater into a machinery space. The ship's list increased. As the deck tilted, the forward 40 mm training axis skewed. The mount canted, its near side barrels drooping slightly. The crew kept their feet by bracing against splinter shields and the metal lip of the tub. Tracer still poured out. Down in the DC spaces, Clark's boots sloshed as he waded through increasing water. He ordered counterflooding and designated compartments to reduce the growing list, even as pumps fought to keep up with inflow. Men around him worked with faces blackened by smoke, eyes reddened, some bleeding from minor wounds they hadn't noticed yet. "Die later," Clark told them when one sailor hesitated over a cut arm. "Work now." At 19:01, another kamikaze came in low on the port bow, slipping under some of the heavier flak. Lavaris mount tracked late. Power was erratic now, and the manual handwheels could only slew so fast. They hammered the plane at 800, 600, 400 yards. Pieces flew off, but its trajectory didn't change enough. It struck just forward of the bridge. The world turned white and red for Sanders and the officer's topside. Fire rolled back along the superstructure. Men were blown overboard, windows shattered. When the concussive roar faded, the bridge was a wreck of twisted metal, sparking wires, and bodies. Sanders dragged himself up, ears ringing, and groped for the voice tube. "Forward guns. Still. Firing?" he croaked. Out his blasted bridge wing, through the hellish glare of his own ship burning, he could see the quad Bofors, still stuttering, cycling, tracking. Barrels glowing, mount slewing unevenly, deck under it slick with blood and oil, and yet tracers still clawed into the sky. One of the Japanese pilots in the last wave, maybe Sato, maybe another, lined up his final dive and saw something that gave him a last moment's pause. A destroyer with her bow smashed, superstructure crushed, listing, decks engulfed in smoke and fire, and one forward gun spitting an unbroken stream of flame at him as if nothing else on that ship existed. He tightened his harness and pressed on. Behind that mounting shield, Lavaris's crew were down 2 men. Another was working with his left arm only, his right hanging limp from a shrapnel hit. The loader's hands were raw, gloves shredded. They had no idea how many planes they'd hit. They only knew the cameras on the director, the screams on the phones, and the shapes in the sights. The pipe stayed jammed under the firing pedal. The last of the ready service ammo racks ran low. Men ran hand to hand from farther lockers, slipping on the sloping, burning deck, carrying clips like relay runners through fire. Even as water flooded in compartments below, even as Aaron Ward's stern settled, the quad Bofors roared. When the last Japanese plane finally veered off or fell short, some shot down, some breaking off to hunt other targets, that gun was still firing, its gunners too adrenalized and half-deaf to realize the attack was over. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" the order finally came down. The pipe was kicked free. The barrels spat one last series of tracers, then fell blessedly silent, heat shimmering around them. Only then did anyone notice that the deck under their boots was closer to the water than it should have been. Aaron Ward was sinking. By full dark, the ocean around Radar Picket Station 10 was littered with survivors, wreckage, and burning patches of oil. USS Little was gone. LSM 195 was gone. LCS 25 lay scarred and half-blind. Aaron Ward wallowed, listing, decks awash aft, fires still smoldering despite hours of work. She should have gone under. Hits from multiple kamikazes had smashed her hull, flooded key compartments, twisted her superstructure almost beyond recognition. 80 men were dead or wounded. But she did not go under. Clark and his damage control team had fought the sea to a standstill. They'd rigged shoring in impossible spaces, sealed off compartments with water lapping at their waists, juggled pumps and valves until the list stopped growing and settled at a survivable angle. He would later recall working for 30 straight hours with barely a pause, driven by something beyond fatigue. Long after the first urgent phase, he continued moving through smoke and darkness, checking patches, ordering adjustments. It would be decades before the Navy officially recognized what he and his men had done that night. As a black steward in 1945, his heroism went into after-action reports, but not into the medal pipeline. Only in the 1990s did Carl Clark finally receive the Navy Cross he'd earned in those flooded compartments off Okinawa. Up top, the story took a different form. Among the survivors, talk coalesced around two things: the pilots and CIC crew who had held some semblance of order in a chaos of attackers, and one forward quad 40mm that, as more than one sailor put it, never shut up until the bastards were gone. In the days after, photographers came aboard as tugs nursed Aaron Ward back toward safer waters. They took pictures of the smashed bow, the crumpled bridge, the jagged impact points. They also took shots of that forward Bofors, barrels blackened, paint blistered, old shoes and shell casings still ankle-deep in the shielded tub. Someone found the length of pipe that had wedged the firing pedal and laid it on the gun shield as a kind of unofficial medal. In official histories of the Okinawa campaign, Aaron Ward earned sober commendations for her gallant stand under repeated suicide attacks. Her gunners were credited with multiple kills. Her crew's discipline and skill were praised. What didn't always make the neat summary paragraphs was the sheer improvised stubbornness of that one mount and the men who fed it. From the Japanese side, Kikusui Number Five was another costly, bloody thrust in a campaign of hopeless fury. Pilots like Sato never returned to tell what they'd seen. But some ground-based observers and intelligence analysts later noted, resistance from Picket ships remained intense even after they had taken multiple hits, as if their guns were independent creatures that would not stop firing until torn from their mounts. The metaphor wasn't far off. After the war, as anti-aircraft technology evolved, navies around the world embraced the core lesson that Aaron Ward's forward Bofors had illustrated in such brutal fashion. Against fast, diving threats, there is no substitute for relentless, high-rate, automatically directed fire. The phalanx CIWS mounts that now bristle on modern warships are descendants of that mindset. Self-contained gun systems that, once engaged, spew a continuous stream of metal until the threat is dead. No wedges of pipe anymore, just radar and software doing what Lavaris once did with muscle and guts. On paper, it all becomes engineering, rates of fire, engagement envelopes, probability of kill. But at the root of it lies a night north of Okinawa, when a destroyer mine layer stood mostly alone on a picked-over patch of sea, and one of her guns fired so long and so hard that men later swore they could still hear it in their dreams. Years later, in a veterans' hall or at a reunion, survivors of Aaron Ward would find each other. Conversation would inevitably turn to that evening. Remember when the bow was damn near in the water and that forward 40 was still hammering? Someone would say, chuckling without much humor. Yeah, another man would answer. I remember thinking if the whole ship went down, that damn gun would still be shooting from the bottom. They would laugh, but only briefly. Then the talk would turn to names, to those who hadn't walked off the ship, to Dudley and Henderson on another ship, to Little's men, to all the picket crews whose stations had become gravestones. Machines rust, ammunition is spent, ships are scrapped. What endures are stories of moments when people, facing the worst the war could throw at them, looked at what they had left. A flooded engine room, a length of pipe, a mount that could still turn, and said, "We're not done yet." When this gun started firing then. At May evening, It was just another Bofors on just another destroyer. By the time Aaron Ward sagged, bloodied but alive, behind the horizon, that gun had become something else. A symbol of a crew's refusal to go quietly, a steel echo that said, "As long as there is breath in any of us, and a round left in the ready locker, we will keep shooting back."